I am Joshua, 31, and for my parents' 40th anniversary, I flew 3,000 miles with a gift wrapped in gold paper. Before I tell you about the moment that shattered my family and sent my parents driving 14 hours straight to my front door, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The music was loud. It was a classic country song, the kind my dad used to play on his old cassette deck when I was a kid, and it was bleeding through the thin walls of the house I grew up in on Maple Drive. I stood on the front porch for a long time, the wooden planks groaning slightly under my weight. In my hands, I held a sturdy cardboard box that I had carefully wrapped in shiny gold paper. It caught the afternoon sunlight, glaring brightly. That box was not just a simple anniversary gift. It was 5 years of my life, my entire 20s, boxed up, sealed, and tied with a ribbon. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the familiar scent of Ohio autumn air, dry leaves and distant wood smoke, and I opened the screen door. I stepped right into the living room. There were at least 60 people crammed into that space. The air was thick with the smell of baked ziti, cheap cologne, and stale beer. Neighbors I recognized from my childhood, cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, and friends of my parents were all laughing and talking over each other. Then the room went dead quiet. It was the kind of silence that drops like an anvil. Forks stopped scraping against paper plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. My brother, Matthew, was standing near the massive anniversary cake. The moment he saw me, his jaw locked instantly. His eyes darted around the room, panicking for a fraction of a second before hardening into a glare. But before he could even take a single step toward me, my mom spoke. She was sitting next to my dad in a padded folding chair, smoothing the fabric of her nice floral dress. She didn't smile. She didn't stand up to hug the son who had just flown across the country to be there. "We didn't invite you, Joshua," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in that silent room, it cut through the air like a butcher's knife. "Your brother planned this." 60 pairs of eyes burned into my skin. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I forced my face to remain totally blank. My chest felt like it was caving in, cracking under the weight of her words. I walked straight toward the main table, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and I gently set the gold box down right next to the frosting on the cake. "I came to give you something," I said, looking right at my dad. My dad, Robert, didn't even look at the box. His face turned a dark, furious red, the thick veins in his neck bulging tightly against his stiff Sunday collar. He reached out with a heavy hand and shoved the box hard. It slid rapidly across the plastic tablecloth and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The pristine gold paper ripped open at the corner. "We don't want any cheap thing from you," he growled, his voice vibrating with absolute disgust. "You show up out of nowhere to ruin Matthew's hard work. Get out." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just bent down, picked up the torn box, and looked at the two people who brought me into this world. "I came to give you something I spent 5 years working for," I said, my voice rock steady. "But I won't stand here and be humiliated for loving you." I turned around and began the long walk back to the front door. Every step felt like I was moving through wet cement. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared to cough. No one whispered. I could feel the collective judgment of my entire extended family pressing heavily on my back. Just as I reached the entryway, Aunt Sarah stepped out from the kitchen. She grabbed my arm. Her grip was startlingly tight, her fingernails digging into my jacket. She didn't look angry. She looked desperate. "Leave it with me," she whispered, her eyes fiercely locked onto mine. "Trust me." I looked at the torn gold paper in my hands, then at her. I handed her the box without a word. I pushed open the screen door and walked out into the cold October air. I walked down the cracked concrete driveway and got into my rental car. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I stared at the house, the faded brown siding, the crooked gutters that always leaked in the spring, the large front window where I could still see the blurry shadows of people moving inside. The tension radiating through my shoulders and neck felt worse than the stories my coworkers told about going through a bitter divorce. It was a visceral, physical ache. I had just handed over my entire life savings, my youth, my peace of mind, and they had thrown it on the floor like it was a piece of garbage. I finally put the key in the ignition, shifted the car into drive, and pulled away from the curb. I drove slowly down Maple Drive, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the large oak trees at the end of the block. I had saved that roof over their heads. I had kept them from sleeping on the street, and they didn't even know it. The emptiness in my stomach was heavy and profound. I wasn't just driving away from a family gathering. I was driving away from my family, completely and perhaps permanently. The road ahead of me was long, stretching out into the flat Ohio landscape, and the silence inside the car was deafening. I drove for about 20 minutes until I found a desolate gas station on the very edge of town. I pulled in and parked near the air pump. I needed a minute to breathe. I walked inside, bought a bitter black coffee in a styrofoam cup, and walked back out to the parking lot. I sat on the cold hood of the rental car and watched the sun begin to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and dark orange. The wind picked up, biting through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing, replaying the look of sheer contempt on my father's face. Why did it hurt so much? I should have expected it. I had expected it on some level. But hoping for a different outcome is a dangerous game. To understand why that box was so incredibly heavy, and why my dad's reaction felt like a bullet straight to the chest, you have to understand the massive shadow I grew up in. I wasn't just the second born in the Mitchell family. I was the ghost of the family. Everything in our house, every decision, every dollar spent, every ounce of praise, revolved around one person. To understand why I chose to hide my identity for 5 long years and secretly pay their debts, you have to know exactly how my parents worshipped my brother. They built a shrine to Matthew, and I was just the janitor hired to sweep the floors around it. Growing up in Hardin, Ohio, the rules of our household were incredibly simple and strictly enforced. Matthew was the blazing sun, and I was just a rock floating in the dark, taking up space. Matthew was loud, athletic, and possessed a charismatic charm that easily manipulated adults into giving him whatever he wanted. I was quiet, kept my head down, and buried myself in books to escape the constant noise of his achievements. Whenever company came over, my dad would puff out his chest, put his heavy arm proudly around Matthew's shoulder, point a finger at the two of us, and deliver his favorite punchline. "Matthew got the brains and the brawn," my dad would say with a booming laugh. "And Joshua, well, Joshua is just Joshua." Everyone in the room would laugh. The aunts, the uncles, the neighbors. I learned very early on to force a polite smile and stare at my shoes, but every single time he said it, a little piece of my self-worth chipped away and shut down. When Matthew graduated high school, my parents practically emptied their savings to buy him a used Porsche. They said he deserved a luxury car for his potential. He crashed that Porsche into a ditch 6 months later while driving recklessly. Instead of punishing him, my parents quietly drained my entire college fund to pay for his legal fees and buy him a replacement truck. When I brought home straight A's and a scholarship letter, my report cards stayed on the kitchen counter for days until my mom finally tossed them in a junk drawer. I was a spectator in my own home, watching a movie where I wasn't even listed in the credits. The day I turned 18, I made the only logical decision I could make to survive. I packed my entire life into 2 battered suitcases and 1 taped-up cardboard box. I had been accepted into a demanding nursing program in Denver, Colorado. I had spent my senior year working double shifts washing dishes at a local diner just to pay for my one-way bus ticket and first month's rent out west. The morning I finally left, the house was quiet. My dad was lying on his back under the kitchen sink, fixing a leaky PVC pipe. He had his greasy tools spread out across the linoleum floor. I stood in the doorway, my heavy bags gripping my calloused hands. "I'm heading out, Dad," I said, my voice betraying a slight tremor of hope that maybe, just this once, he would get up. He didn't slide out from under the sink. He didn't drop his heavy wrench. He just grunted, the sound echoing hollowly inside the cabinet. "Good," he said, his voice flat and annoyed. "One less mouth to feed." That was my grand send-off. There was no warm hug. There were no tears of pride. There was no advice for the road. There was just profound relief that I was finally removing my inconvenient existence from their perfect family portrait. I turned around, walked out the front door, and dragged my suitcases to the Greyhound bus station completely alone. For the first 2 years living in Denver, I genuinely tried to fix things. I believed that distance might make the heart grow fonder. I scheduled a call every single Sunday evening at exactly 6 p.m. My mom would answer occasionally, sounding distracted by the television in the background, and she would rush me off the phone within 3 minutes. My dad never once came to the receiver. One year, I spent weeks hand-carving a beautiful wooden clock for their Christmas present. I boxed it up perfectly and shipped it to Ohio. January rolled around, and I never heard a single word about it. No thank you text, no phone call. I finally caved and called Aunt Sarah, my mom's younger sister, to ask if the package had somehow gotten lost in the mail. "Oh, Joshua?" Aunt Sarah sighed heavily, the sound crackling over the phone line. "Matthew told them you probably bought it at a cheap thrift store. I saw it sitting in the garage garbage can yesterday, completely covered in sawdust." I held the phone to my ear, my vision blurring slightly. I thanked her and hung up. That was the exact day I stopped calling. They didn't just forget me. They were actively and aggressively erasing me from their narrative. I threw my entire soul into my grueling work at the hospital ICU. I built a life from scratch. I met Emily, a brilliant, compassionate woman who saw me for who I actually was, not who my family told me I was. I mentally buried Hardin, Ohio. At least that's what I truly thought. Fast forward to a bitter, freezing night in March. I was 26 years old, working a brutal 14-hour night shift in the intensive care unit. The smell of strong antiseptic and bleached linens filled my nose. I had just finished stabilizing a patient when I felt my phone violently buzzing in the pocket of my scrubs. It was 2 a.m. I pulled it out and saw the caller ID glowing brightly. Aunt Sarah. My stomach instantly dropped to the floor. Phone calls from relatives at 2 in the morning never bring anything but disaster. I stepped quickly into a quiet, dimly lit supply closet, surrounded by boxes of saline and sterile bandages, and answered. "Aunt Sarah? Is someone hurt? Is it Dad?" "Joshua, it's the house." Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Your parents are 3 full months behind on the mortgage payments. The bank just sent a final notice of foreclosure in the mail today. They are going to lose the house by the end of the month." I leaned heavily against the cold metal shelving, running a hand over my exhausted face. "How does that happen? Does Matthew know?" "He lives 10 minutes away. Matthew is the one who told them not to worry about the bills," Aunt Sarah said, her tone dripping with absolute, unbridled disgust. "He promised them he would handle the paperwork and the payments. He told them he had it all under control." The next morning, after my shift ended, I didn't go to sleep. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. I dug up the official phone number for First National Bank in Hardin and asked to be directly connected to Carter, the senior branch manager. I explained exactly who I was and asked about the foreclosure status of the Mitchell property. Mr. Carter hesitated on the line, the sound of keyboard typing echoing in the background. Then he let out a long, heavy sigh. "Listen, Joshua. Technically, I shouldn't tell you this, but your brother called me 4 weeks ago. He swore up and down he was wiring the overdue balance immediately to stop our legal department. He said he was a successful businessman, but the money never came. I've tried calling his cell phone every day this week, but it goes straight to voicemail. The bank's lawyer is officially filing the foreclosure paperwork on Monday morning." My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Matthew played the heroic savior to my parents, promised to save them from ruin, and then cowardly abandoned them when the actual bill came due. He lied straight to their trusting faces while the bank prepared to kick 2 elderly people to the curb. I didn't call my parents to warn them. I didn't scream at Matthew over the phone. I just opened my laptop and looked at my checking account. I was making a decent nursing salary, taking home enough to live comfortably, but I was far from rich. "Mr. Carter," I said into the phone, my voice dropping an octave. "If I set up an automatic wire transfer of $2,300 every single month from my account, will that stop the foreclosure and pay down the principal balance?" "Yes, absolutely," he said, sounding surprised. "But Joshua, whose name goes on the payment receipts?" "Keep it entirely anonymous," I instructed firmly. "Do not tell my parents. Do not tell my brother. Nobody finds out this money is coming from me." I hung up the phone and waited for Emily to get home from her shift. I sat her down at our small table and showed her the grim spreadsheet I had built. "I have to do this," I told her, my voice cracking slightly. "But it means giving up a huge chunk of my salary. It means no vacations, no eating out, just rent, utilities, and cheap groceries for the next 5 years." Emily didn't yell. She didn't call me crazy. She just reached across the table, put her warm hand firmly over mine, and looked me in the eyes. "We'll make it work," she said softly. For the next 5 years, I worked myself straight to the bone. I picked up every single extra shift the hospital offered. I worked Christmas Eve, Thanksgiving morning, and New Year's night. I drove a beat-up, rust-covered Honda with a failing transmission because I couldn't afford to take it to a mechanic. I wore the same 4 pairs of hospital scrubs everywhere to avoid buying normal street clothes. When the wooden fence in our backyard blew down in a violent summer storm, Emily didn't complain. She just drove to the hardware store, bought a box of cheap nails, and spent the weekend fixing it herself in the blazing sun to save us the cost of a contractor. Every single month, like clockwork, $2,300 vanished from my bank account and went straight to Ohio. It was grueling. I was utterly exhausted. I even had to turn down a major promotion to a management position because the required training schedule would conflict with my ability to work lucrative overtime shifts. But every month, I logged into the portal and watched the principal balance on my parents' house slowly drop. 3 miserable years into the payment plan, Aunt Sarah called me on Thanksgiving afternoon. "You need to know what's happening here right now," she said, her voice shaking with absolute fury. "Robert just gave a grand toast at the dinner table." He stood up, raised his glass of wine to Matthew, and thanked him publicly for saving the family house. Matthew sat there, smiled, and told them it was no big deal. He told them he's the one paying the mortgage. I gripped my phone so tightly the plastic case creaked. "He took the credit?" "It gets significantly worse," Sarah said. "Because they genuinely think he's their grand savior, they just signed legal papers giving him full control of their checking and savings accounts. They are setting him up to take the entire inheritance. He's taking everything, Joshua. He's bleeding them dry of their retirement funds while you sit in Denver and pay the bills." My blood boiled in my veins. Matthew was deliberately stealing my sacrifice to permanently cement his status as the golden child. I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I wanted the house fully paid off. I wouldn't let my anger ruin my ultimate goal. 5 years passed. 60 agonizing, exhausting months. The final payment cleared the bank system. The total amount transferred from my sweat and tears was $137,412. The house on Maple Drive was entirely paid off. No more bank threats. No more debt. A week later, I was scrolling online and saw Matthew's arrogant post on Facebook. He was hosting a massive 40th anniversary party for my parents. "Family and close friends only," he wrote in the caption, alongside a picture of him hugging my dad. I wasn't tagged. I didn't receive a message. I was completely excluded from the victory lap. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Carter at the bank immediately. "I need the official, notarized mortgage satisfaction certificate," I told him, my tone leaving no room for argument. "And print out all 60 pages of the bank statements showing every single wire transfer from my checking account. Stamp every single page. Make it official." I packed those heavy documents into a nice, sturdy box and wrapped it perfectly in shiny gold paper. It was finally time to go home, which brings us right back to the living room. standing in front of 60 silent people, watching my dad violently shove 5 years of my blood, sweat, and tears off the table. "We don't want any cheap thing from you," he had yelled, the echo bouncing off the walls. Matthew stood securely behind him, a smug, deeply arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He felt entirely untouchable. He had the family money, he had the power, and he had the unwavering adoration of our parents. In his eyes, I was just the unwanted, pathetic pest ruining his perfectly curated party. The hostility in the room was so thick and suffocating. I felt like I was attending a funeral. I was mourning the death of the family I never really had to begin with. I didn't yell back at them. You cannot rationally argue with people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. I slowly bent down, picked up the torn box, smoothed the ripped edges of the gold paper, and looked directly into Matthew's eyes. His arrogant smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second when he saw the absolute deadness in my stare. There was no fear left in me anymore. There was no desperate child seeking approval. I turned around to leave. As I reached the front door, Aunt Sarah aggressively stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Leave it with me," she demanded quietly, physically pulling the heavy box from my hands. I gave her a single, sharp nod, pushed open the screen door, and walked out to my car. I didn't stay to watch the explosion. I didn't need to. The fuse was already lit. I wasn't in the room for what happened next. But Aunt Sarah recounted every single glorious detail to me later. The moment my car pulled away from the curb, Matthew clapped his hands loudly together, trying to break the heavy tension. "All right, everyone, let's cut the cake. Let's get back to celebrating Mom and Dad." Before anyone touches that cake, Aunt Sarah's voice boomed across the crowded room like thunder. She walked right to the center of the living room, holding the torn gold box high in the air. "There is something you all need to see right now." "Sarah, drop it," my dad warned angrily, stepping forward. She completely ignored him. She viciously ripped the rest of the gold paper off the box and pulled out the thick, heavy stack of bank documents. She held up the official watermarked certificate for everyone to see. "Mortgage satisfaction for 1427 Maple Drive," Aunt Sarah read aloud, her voice ringing clear and steady. "Paid in full. Total amount, $137,412. She paused deliberately, locking her furious eyes dead onto Matthew. "Paid entirely by Joshua Robert." The room completely froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Aunt Sarah violently pulled out the 60 pages of bank statements and fanned them out. 60 months. $2,300 every single month. Direct from Joshua's checking account in Denver. He worked double shifts for 5 agonizing years to save this house from foreclosure, while your precious golden boy lied straight to your faces and stole his credit. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. My dad's face went completely, shockingly pale. All the angry red color drained from his skin as he stared at the official papers clutched in Aunt Sarah's shaking hand. He slowly turned his head, his neck popping in the dead silence of the room, to look at his favorite son. "Matthew?" my dad said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, hollow whisper. "You told me you were paying the bank. You swore to me on your mother's life." Matthew took a quick step backward, holding both of his hands up defensively in front of his chest. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. "Dad, I meant to. I handled the initial paperwork with the lawyer. Joshua is just trying to manipulate the situation to make me look bad in front of everyone. Those papers are probably fake. You know how he is." Uncle John, my dad's brother, stepped aggressively out of the crowd. He was a retired police officer, a massive man with a no-nonsense attitude, and he certainly didn't play games. He snatched the thick stack of papers from Aunt Sarah's hands and examined the raised bank seals and the signature of Mr. Carter at the bottom. "These are certified, official bank records, Robert," Uncle John said, his voice rumbling with authority as he looked at my dad. "Every single dime came directly from Joshua's account in Denver. Your golden boy didn't pay a red cent." Aunt Donna, my dad's sister, crossed her arms tightly across her chest and glared at Matthew with unmasked revulsion. "You let your younger brother starve and work himself to death to pay your parents' bills, and then you stole the credit just to get control of their bank accounts? You make me sick to my stomach, boy." The shocked murmurs in the room rapidly grew louder. Disgust, absolute anger, heavy judgment. Matthew frantically looked around the room, making eye contact with neighbors and cousins, realizing he was completely surrounded by people who now knew exactly what he was. His perfect, charming facade had entirely shattered, and the ugly, cowardly truth was bleeding out onto the floor for everyone to finally see. He didn't apologize to his parents. He didn't try to explain himself further. Like the absolute coward he always was, he grabbed his car keys from the side table, aggressively pushed past Mrs. Patterson, slipped through the sliding glass door in the kitchen, and sprinted to his car. A few seconds later, the entire party heard his tires screeching violently against the asphalt as he sped away from the house, abandoning the mess he had created. The celebratory atmosphere of the anniversary party died instantly and permanently. The guests, feeling the crushing weight of the family tragedy they had just witnessed, quietly gathered their coats and purses and began slipping out the front door one by one. Nobody wanted to look my parents in the eye. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man who had lived next door since before I was even in diapers, stopped at the doorway on his way out. He slowly turned around and looked back at my dad, who was now slumped heavily in his folding chair, staring blankly at the floor. "You threw a good boy away, Robert," Mr. Jenkins said softly, his voice full of pity. "I truly hope your stubborn pride keeps you warm at night, because you don't have much else left." When the house was finally completely empty, the silence was agonizing. My dad sat alone at the long table, surrounded by half-eaten pieces of anniversary cake, crumpled napkins, and dirty paper plates. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the massive stack of bank statements toward him. My mom sat right next to him, her hands covering her mouth, shaking violently. For 2 agonizing hours, they didn't speak a single word to each other. Dad just flipped through the pages, page after page, month after agonizing month. $2,300, $2,300, $2,300. My name, Joshua Robert, printed clearly on every single line of every single page. He saw the specific transaction dates. He saw payments made on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, on my own birthdays, days when they hadn't even bothered to pick up the phone to call me. While they were ignoring my existence, I was sending them a massive portion of my salary just to keep a solid roof over their heads. My mom finally put her face in her hands and began to sob loudly, the sound tearing through the quiet house. The horrible realization washed over her. She had sat there, quiet and compliant, and allowed her husband to publicly humiliate and banish the very son who had sacrificed his entire youth for their survival. Dad finally reached the last page of the stack, the heavy payoff certificate. He slowly ran his rough thumb over the raised gold foil of the official bank stamp. And for the very first time in 40 years of marriage, Robert Mitchell completely broke down. He wept. He cried so incredibly hard his chest heaved and he gasped for air. He had violently pushed his own son's bleeding heart off a table, choosing the charming liar over the silent savior. He abruptly stood up from the table, aggressively wiped his wet face with the back of his sleeve, and looked down at my mom with a look of fierce determination she hadn't seen in decades. "Get your heavy winter coat, Mary," he ordered, his voice thick with tears. She looked up at him, bewildered and terrified. "Where on earth are we going at this hour?" she cried. "We are driving to Denver." At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, under a cold, starless and pitch-black Ohio sky, my dad backed his heavy Ford pickup truck out of the cracked concrete driveway on Maple Drive. He didn't pack a travel suitcase. He didn't grab a change of clothes. He didn't even bother to take off the stiff, uncomfortable Sunday dress shirt he had worn to the disastrous anniversary party. My mom climbed silently into the passenger seat. She was clutching a large thermos of bitter black coffee in her right hand and that torn, heavy cardboard box in her left. Aunt Sarah had carefully patched the ripped gold paper with clear packing tape before she finally left their house. My mom held that taped-up box tightly against her chest like it was a fragile glass sculpture, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. They pulled out onto Route 31, heading west toward the dark interstate. They didn't call ahead to tell me they were coming. They didn't send a warning text message. They didn't even know if I would open the door for them. They just drove. For the first 4 hours of that grueling trip, the only sound inside the cramped cab of that truck was the repetitive, rhythmic hum of the heavy tires against the cold asphalt and the low, rattling blast of the heater keeping the October chill away. The odometer turned over mile after agonizing mile in the dark. Ohio slowly bled into the flat farm fields of Indiana. Indiana eventually gave way to the endless, sweeping plains of Illinois. They crossed the massive bridge over the Mississippi River just as the morning sun began to bleed over the horizon in the rearview mirror, painting the sky in pale, bruised streaks of gray and yellow. My mom told me the intimate details about that drive months later. She said the silence between them in that truck was completely different from the angry, stubborn, punishing silence they had weaponized against me for the last 5 years. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of two elderly people who had just watched the entire foundation of their lives crumble into absolute dust. Every single time my dad looked in the rearview mirror, he wasn't just checking the highway traffic. He was looking at his own horrible mistakes staring right back at him. He gripped the leather steering wheel so hard his knuckles ached with arthritis. He thought about the countless times he had openly mocked my quiet nature to his friends. He thought about how they had eagerly drained my entire college fund to bail Matthew out of trouble, leaving me to wash dishes to survive. He thought about the day I packed my bags for Denver and he refused to even slide out from under the kitchen sink to say a proper goodbye. But most of all, he thought about the sheer, blinding arrogance of his favorite son. Matthew had willingly let me sacrifice my hard-earned salary and my youth while he paraded around our hometown soaking up the glory, plotting to steal the family inheritance. They drove relentlessly through Missouri and straight into the flat, windy stretch of Kansas. They stopped only twice for gas and bathroom breaks. They didn't buy food. Their stomachs were tied in too many knots of guilt and shame to even think about eating a meal. When they finally crossed the state line into Colorado, the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains began to appear in the far distance. 14 hours of relentless, punishing, non-stop driving. 14 hours of confronting the ugly, undeniable truth of what they had done to their own flesh and blood. At that exact moment, I was fast asleep in my bed in Denver, completely unaware that the heavy ghosts of my past were barreling down the highway at 70 miles an hour, heading straight toward my front door. The next morning, I woke up early, exactly like I always do. The sun was just starting to crest over the quiet Denver neighborhood, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered front lawns. Emily was still fast asleep, wrapped warmly in the thick down blankets. I quietly slipped out of bed, pulled on my thick winter robe, and walked barefoot into the kitchen to make a strong pot of coffee. I desperately needed the caffeine to wash away the lingering, exhausting nightmare of the anniversary party. I poured myself a steaming ceramic mug, unlocked the heavy deadbolt on the front door, and stepped out onto my small wooden porch. The morning air was biting cold, but it smelled clean and sharp. I stood there, taking a deep breath, trying to mentally prepare myself for my upcoming 12-hour shift at the hospital. Then, I heard the distinct, heavy rumble of an unfamiliar engine turning onto my street. A dusty, road-weary white pickup truck rolled slowly down the block. The fenders were thickly coated in a layer of gray highway grime. I squinted as it pulled to a clumsy stop right against the curb directly in front of my house. The license plate was from Ohio. The engine ticked loudly in the crisp morning quiet as the ignition was cut off. The heavy driver's door groaned open, and a man stepped out onto the asphalt. It took my brain a full 3 seconds to process exactly what I was looking at. It was my father, Robert Mitchell. He was 64 years old, but standing there in the harsh, unforgiving morning light, he looked like he had rapidly aged 10 years overnight. His face was pale, gray, and deeply lined with exhaustion. His eyes were completely bloodshot, surrounded by dark, heavy, bruised circles from driving 14 hours straight without a single wink of sleep. His broad shoulders, usually pulled back with stubborn, unyielding pride, were slumped forward in total defeat. My mom slowly, shakily climbed out of the passenger side door. She was holding the gold box. The torn corner was neatly patched with fresh, clear packing tape. She clutched it tightly against her heavy winter coat, looking up at me with absolute terror and desperate pleading in her swollen, red eyes. They stood at the very end of my concrete walkway. There was 20 feet of freezing pavement between us, but it might as well have been a massive, uncrossable canyon. My dad didn't immediately move forward. He just stood there, his large, calloused hands hanging uselessly at his sides. His jaw worked nervously side to side, exactly like it did when he was frustrated, like he was trying to chew on heavy words that simply wouldn't go down his dry throat. I didn't run down the wooden steps to greet them. I didn't force a polite smile. I stood my ground firmly on the porch, my hands securely wrapped around my warm coffee mug, my bare feet freezing against the wood planks. We just looked at each other in total silence. A neighbor's dog barked a few houses down. A lawn sprinkler hissed to life across the street. The entire ordinary world kept moving forward around us while my fractured family stood completely frozen in time. Finally, my father took a slow, heavy step forward. His voice, usually a booming, intimidating instrument of absolute authority, was stripped down to an incredibly fragile, raspy whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 simple words. 7 letters. I had waited my entire 31 years of life to hear those words come from that man's mouth. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and tried again. His voice cracked violently on the next sentence. "Joshua." I pushed away the only person who was actually holding us up. I violently shoved your heart right off a table in front of the whole world. I am so deeply, terribly sorry. I didn't collapse in a puddle of tears. I didn't rush forward to embrace him. I stood tall on my porch, letting the cold Colorado wind bite my face, and I let those heavy words land exactly where they needed to land in my soul. I absorbed the apology, but I didn't instantly absolve him. My mom broke first. She let out a sharp, agonizing sob and practically ran up the concrete walkway, stopping abruptly right at the bottom of the wooden porch stairs. She didn't try to climb them. She knew without asking that she had to wait for my permission to enter my space. "Joshua, please," she cried, tears spilling hot and fast down her wrinkled cheeks. Deep down, I think I always knew Matthew wasn't telling the truth. I saw the inconsistencies in his stories, but I was so incredibly scared. I was scared of arguing with your father. I was scared of losing Matthew's affection. I let him push your beautiful gift off that table, in front of all our friends, and I just sat there like a statue. I will never, ever forgive myself for being such a miserable coward. I looked down at her. I looked at the dark, heavy bags under her eyes, the desperate, knuckle-white grip she had on the box I had bled for, the fierce, burning anger that had been boiling inside my chest for 5 long years suddenly lost its searing heat. It didn't magically disappear, but it fundamentally changed shape. It turned into a profound, exhausted sadness for 2 people who had been blinded by their own toxic favoritism. I took a slow step back, reached out, and opened the front screen door wider. "Come inside," I said simply, my voice completely level. "Both of you. It's freezing out here." It wasn't a warm, cinematic, tear-jerking reunion. I want to be entirely honest with you about that. I didn't fall into anyone's arms weeping. I walked them into my small kitchen, pulled out 2 mismatched wooden chairs at the cheap estate sale dining table where Emily and I ate all our quiet meals, and told them to sit down. I walked to the sink and poured them 2 large glasses of ice water. My hands were perfectly steady. I had spent 5 years learning exactly how to control my intense emotions in high-stress trauma situations at the hospital. I set the glasses down, sat directly across from my parents, and looked at them. Emily came out of the bedroom a few minutes later, tying the belt of her robe. She saw my parents sitting awkwardly at our table, looking absolutely wrecked and out of place. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask questions. She just walked over, placed a warm, supportive hand firmly on my shoulder, gave my dad a curt, serious nod, and quietly went into the living room to give us privacy. She knew this was my specific battle to fight, and she respected my space. "I am glad you drove here," I said, my voice calm but laced with absolute steel. But showing up one single time with a desperate apology does not automatically erase 5 years of total silence. It doesn't magically erase a lifetime of making me feel like I was a burden in my own home. My dad nodded rapidly. He didn't try to argue with me. He didn't offer a single pathetic excuse. "You are absolutely right," he said, staring intently down at his bruised, calloused hands resting on my table. "I have absolutely no right to sit here and ask for your immediate forgiveness. I just needed to look you directly in the eye and tell you that you are a vastly better man than I ever was. If we are going to have any kind of relationship moving forward," I continued, leaning slightly across the table to ensure they felt the gravity of my words, "things are going to be fundamentally different. I love you both. I proved that by sacrificing my 20s to save your home. But I absolutely refuse to ever go back to being invisible. I will never play second fiddle again." My mom nodded furiously, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "I need you to completely understand something," I told my dad, locking eyes with him. "I don't need you to repay the money. That was a gift to keep a roof over your heads. But I will never again tolerate being treated like a second-class citizen just so Matthew can feel tall. If he is running the show, if he is the golden boy, I am out. Permanently. You will never see me again." My dad sat up straighter in his chair. A flash of hard, intense anger crossed his exhausted face. But for the first time in my life, that anger wasn't directed at me. "Matthew is entirely done," he said grimly, his jaw clenching tight. "When we finally left the house last night, I called his phone and left him a voicemail. I told him he is no longer welcome on my property. And first thing tomorrow morning, I am calling a ruthless lawyer." He took a deep, shaky breath. He maliciously manipulated us into giving him full power of attorney. He was actively trying to position himself to steal the entire inheritance and leave you with absolutely nothing. We are having the lawyer completely revoke his access to every single bank account. We are rewriting the will immediately. He gets nothing, not a single red cent. He used your grueling salary to build his massive ego, and I will be damned if I let him take another thing from this family. Hearing my fiercely stubborn father actively defend me, actively choose my well-being over Matthew's, felt entirely surreal. It was a massive tectonic shift in the foundation of my life. It felt like I was finally breathing oxygen after drowning for 30 years. We sat at that small table for 3 full hours. The morning sun came fully up, filling the kitchen with bright, harsh daylight. We didn't solve everything. You cannot magically fix 3 decades of toxic favoritism and 5 years of deep betrayal in a single morning conversation over tap water. But for the very first time in my 31 years of life, my parents actually saw me. They saw the independent man I had become. They saw the immense strength it took to carry their heavy financial burdens in total, agonizing silence. When they finally stood up to leave and find a local motel to sleep off the grueling drive, my dad turned to me at the front door. He awkwardly reached out, and for the first time since I was a little boy playing in the yard, he pulled me into a tight, fierce, desperate hug. "I am so incredibly proud of you, Joshua," he whispered into my shoulder, his voice breaking. "I should have said it every single day of your life." News travels through a small, working-class town like Hardin, Ohio, faster than a raging wildfire in dry brush. By Sunday morning, exactly half the town knew that Matthew Mitchell was an absolute, undisputed fraud who had lied about paying his parents' mortgage to steal the glory. By Monday afternoon, the other half knew the rest of the ugly, shameful details. Aunt Sarah and Uncle John made absolutely sure the correct, factual version of the story was told loudly at the local diner, at the hardware store, and in the parking lot after church services. The people in town didn't necessarily confront Matthew directly in the streets. They didn't have to yell at him or throw stones. They employed a much more brutal, effective tactic. They simply stopped talking to him. The local mechanics suddenly stopped giving his truck priority scheduling. The guys he used to drink cheap beer with at the local tavern on Friday nights suddenly found themselves way too busy to hang out. The cashiers at the grocery store stopped making friendly small talk and just handed him his printed receipts in awkward, heavy silence. In a tight-knit town of 4,000 people, that kind of collective, impenetrable silence is an absolute social death sentence. It is its own terrible, inescapable verdict. True to his word on my porch, my dad marched aggressively into the local bank branch the very next Tuesday. He sat down across the heavy mahogany desk from Mr. Carter and personally signed the legal documents completely revoking Matthew's access to all joint checking and savings accounts. Then, he drove his truck straight to his lawyer's office downtown. The lawyer immediately drafted up the ironclad paperwork to completely remove Matthew from the family inheritance, ensuring the house I paid for with my blood and sweat would never, ever fall into his greedy hands. Matthew completely panicked. He suddenly realized his main source of funding, his unearned pride, and his elevated social standing had evaporated entirely overnight. 3 days after the disastrous anniversary party, he sent a massive, desperate group text message to the entire extended family, including my number. It was a long, winding, pathetic paragraph about how Aunt Sarah had maliciously manipulated the entire situation to turn everyone against him. He ridiculously claimed he had fully intended to pay the bank all along and that I was just being petty and jealous. He desperately tried to paint himself as the real victim of a massive, unfair family conspiracy. Nobody replied. Not a single person typed a word back. Aunt Sarah took a quick screenshot of the pathetic group chat and sent it directly to me with a single text message attached. The whole town is talking. Not about the money, Joshua. They are talking about the incredible kind of person you are. I read her message twice, letting the words sink in. I felt a profound, settling sense of justice, but I didn't feel the need to gloat or rub his face in the dirt. I didn't block Matthew's phone number, but I never responded to him. I simply put my phone down on the counter, poured myself another cup of coffee, and went back to living my peaceful life. I absolutely refused to play his ridiculous, toxic games anymore. That all happened several months ago. The heavy dust has finally settled. The initial shock has worn off, and a brand new, healthier reality has taken shape in my life. The world didn't magically pause just because my family finally realized my worth. The hospital didn't close its doors. I still had to clock in at the ICU. I still had to check patient vitals, start difficult 4 lines, and deal with the exhausting, chaotic reality of working in emergency medicine. But the heavy, suffocating weight I had been dragging around on my shoulders for years was finally gone. I walked taller down the hospital corridors. I breathed easier in my own home. Because the mortgage was finally paid off, I got to keep my entire salary. For the first time in 5 years, my bank account started to actually grow. I was finally able to accept the major promotion to head charge nurse because I no longer had to kill myself working endless overtime shifts just to cover my parents' debts. Emily and I took our first real vacation to the mountains, and we actually ordered appetizers at dinner without silently doing the math in our heads. My dad calls me every single Sunday evening at exactly 7 p.m. without fail. He never misses a call. Sometimes we talk for a full hour about local politics, the changing weather, or the new wooden deck I am building in the backyard. Sometimes the call only lasts 10 minutes because I'm tired from a shift. But he always makes the effort. He asks about Emily's day. He asks about the stress of my work. He actually stops talking and listens when I speak. My mom started sending me handwritten letters in the mail every few weeks. They aren't long, dramatic, weeping apologies. They are just little, sweet notes written on the familiar floral stationery she has used since I was in middle school. Saw a beautiful blue jay in the yard today, and remembered how much you loved birds when you were a little boy. Thinking of you. Love, Mom. Small things. Real things. Consistent, undeniable proof that she is actively thinking of me. This past Christmas, they did something I genuinely never thought I would see in my lifetime. They bought expensive airline tickets and flew all the way to Denver to spend the holiday week with Emily and me. My dad is absolutely terrified of flying. He white-knuckled the armrests the entire flight, but he got on that plane anyway just to see my face. My mom brought 3 massive tins of her homemade chocolate chip cookies, packed safely in layers of bubble wrap. We ate a quiet, beautiful holiday dinner at my cheap estate sale kitchen table. We laughed loudly. We drank good red wine. And absolutely nobody mentioned the empty chair in the room where Matthew might have sat. Matthew is no longer the center of our universe. He is just a bitter ghost haunting his own bad decisions back in Ohio. I didn't brutally cut him off out of pure spite. That's not what this is. I just simply stopped chasing a relationship with a deeply selfish person who only ever saw me as an obstacle to his own greatness. If he ever truly wants to be a part of my life, he knows exactly where to find me. But he doesn't get to hold the pen and rewrite the narrative of our family anymore. The pen belongs to me now. Just the other evening, while Emily and I were washing up the dinner dishes in the kitchen, she leaned over, gently bumped her shoulder against mine, and asked me a profound question. "Looking back at absolutely everything," she said softly, handing me a wet plate, "the brutal overtime, the constant financial stress, the 5 grueling years of hiding your identity to protect them, was it really worth it in the end?" I dried the ceramic plate slowly, set it carefully on the metal drying rack, and thought about it. I looked out the kitchen window at the quiet, peaceful life I had built with my own 2 hands. Yes, I told her honestly, without a single ounce of hesitation. It was worth every single penny. I am not telling you this long, complicated story to suggest that you should drain your own bank accounts or pay off a toxic relative's mortgage just to suddenly earn their love and respect. You absolutely cannot buy genuine affection, and trying to do so will only leave you financially bankrupt and emotionally broken. That is absolutely not the lesson I want you to take away from my life. The real, lasting lesson I learned, the hard way through years of pain, is about the true nature of sacrifice and personal self-worth. Do not ever let anyone, not a boss, not a friend, and certainly not a family member, convince you that your kindness is a weakness. My quietness was never submission. It was immense, calculated strength. I didn't win my parents back with a fat check. I won them back by establishing an unbreakable, ironclad boundary and flat out refusing to disappear when they tried to completely erase me from their lives. Sometimes the people who make the least noise in the room are the ones carrying the most incredible weight on their shoulders. You have to be willing to stand up, push back from the table, and walk out the front door when respect is no longer being served. Family is not just about sharing the same blood. It is a daily, consistent demonstration of mutual respect, loyalty, and truth. If someone in your life is selfishly demanding your light just so they can shine a little brighter, you have every right to cut the cord, leave them in the dark, and walk boldly into your own dawn. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in following me this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment below so I know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. And I really want to know what lesson from my story resonated with you the most today. What do you think about setting tough boundaries with your own family? Or the courage to walk away when love isn't reciprocated? Please share your perspective and experience below, or simply leave a comment saying good, so I know this story has brought some positive value to your life. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. Thank you so much.